I have opened the arrays start.xlsm file. Let's go to the Visual Basic editor. In the code module, I have an array intro subroutine. So in this video, we will talk about arrays. Arrays are a collection of values, a collection of items, or a set of values. It doesn't matter which way we refer to them. What matters is that an array is a data structure that can store several values. In the context of VBA, we can think about an array as a single variable that can store several values, or the values of several other variables. Let's declare our first array. So let's type dim, and the name of the array will be employees. Okay. Let's type an opening parenthesis, and now a closing one. And let's put the number 4 inside the parentheses, and let's end the declaration with as string. So now we've declared an array, and this array is the employees array. And inside the parentheses, we declared how many elements or values we want to store in this employees array. You would think that we want to store 4 values, however, we want to store 5 values. In order to retrieve values from arrays, we have to use indexes. We'll be able to store 5 values or 5 strings in this array because arrays are indexed from 0. So this array has an index 0, an index 1, a 2, a 3, and a 4. So altogether 5 indexes. At the end of the declaration, we of course declared that in this array we want to store strings or string values. Let's add or let's store the first value in our array. So let's type employees and in parentheses 0 equals to Sarah. This is of course a hard-coded string, so this is why I have to use the quotes. The syntax for saving a value in the array is that you give the name of the array, which is a variable. So we have an employees variable, which is an array type variable. Inside the parentheses, you define which array index you want to save a value to, and then we assign the value. Let's confirm now that our array indeed contains the value Sarah at index 0. Let's use debug.print as usual. And let's just copy this. So we will print the value at the 0th index in our employees array. Let's press F5. Indeed, Sarah has been printed out. Let's add some more data to our array. So let me just copy this a few times. Let's change the indexes. So index 1, 2, 3, and 4. And let's change these strings as well. Let's say Paul, Emily, Steve, and Joe. I will also copy this debug.print line, and I will change the indexes. Now we expect to see 5 names printed to our immediate window. When we declared our array with the number 4 in parentheses, then what happened is that we declared that the last index or highest index, also referred to as an upper bound, should be 4. So these are now all valid assignments because the first index of an array is a 0, then comes a 1, a 2, a 3, and then the highest index is 4. Let's confirm if these names are printed out without an error. And indeed they are. I just have to make my immediate window a bit bigger. So now Sarah, Paul, Emily, Steve, and Joe have all been printed out. I will clear my immediate window now. What happens if I want to print out a name at an index that doesn't exist? So index 5 doesn't exist in our array because the highest index of this array is 4. Let's see what happens. We got a runtime error, subscript out of range. This means that I'm trying to access an index in our array that does not exist. Our array doesn't have an index of 5. I have the option to start debugging or just simply click on end and I will get back to the code. But now I will just click on end and I will simply delete this line of code. I mentioned earlier that we can regard an array as a data structure. A data structure is a structure for storing data. And we have seen that in an array we can store data by assigning them to indexes in the array. Programming languages usually have arrays or array-like data structures. And it is very common that arrays are indexed from 0. It is uncommon that we can change the indexing of an array, but in VBA we can actually do that. I think in certain cases it can be useful to change the indexing of an array when working with Excel or automating Excel in VBA, but I suggest you get used to indexing from 0, because this is what you will usually see when you work with other programming languages. But of course it is up to you how you index your arrays in VBA. So let me show you how you can change the indexing. So we will not go from 0 to 4, but let's say 1 to 5 here. Let's delete this 4 and let's type 1, 2, 5. You see that the editor actually shows us that currently the array is indexed from 0 to 4. So we have the employees array, the indexes are going from 0 to 4 by default, and this is a string array. But if I navigate from this line, then you see that 2 is a keyword in VBA, so it has special meaning. And we can use 2 to re-index an array or change the indexing of an array. Later you will see that we can use 2 for other things as well, but now we use it to change the indexing. So the syntax for changing the indexing is that you have to put the first index inside the parentheses, then the 2 keyword, and then the last index. If I run the code now, I get the subscript out of range error because there is no 0 index now. Let's click on end, so we will get back to our code. Let me just change this 0 to a 5, and here as well, and let's run the code now. It has run successfully, and all 5 names have been printed out to the immediate window. Notice that the index order doesn't matter when I'm assigning values to the array. Here I start with the last index, index 5, and then I assign values to the other indexes as well. But to make the code clearer, I will actually cut this line and I will paste it here below employee 4, and I will do the same here. So I will cut the debug.print line and I will paste it under this other debug.print line. So now I think the code is a bit less confusing now that the indexes are in order. When we declare an array like this, so when we declare the indexes of the array, then we are creating a so-called static array. There is no way to make this array bigger or smaller, so we cannot remove indexes or add indexes to this array. By the way, this would be also true if we had the array declared like this. So what matters is that if there is something in the parentheses, so if we are declaring the indexes, then the array will be a static array, and it doesn't matter how we declare these indexes. But let's say I change my mind and I want to add a 6th index to the array. I've changed the name of my subroutine from array intro to dynamic array intro, but the rest of the code is the same as we have seen. By the way, I have opened the dynamic arrays start.xlsm file. So I said that I want to change the indexing to this array, so the last index would be 6. Of course I could do this here, so I could delete the 5 and add a 6 here, but this is not what I meant. What I meant is that I want to declare the array, I want to add these 5 names to it, and then I will change my mind and I will want to add a 6th name to the array. To do this, so to change the indexing of an array, I can use the redim keyword, so redimension. This is it. And let me try to redimension this array. Redim employees 1 to 6. I don't have to redeclare that this is an array of strings. I've already done so. Let me navigate away from this line. So redeem is a keyword because it is in blue and the Visual Basic Editor capitalized the R and the D. Let's run our code to check what happens. And we have a compile error because the array has already been dimensioned. Once we declare an array like this with the indexes specified or the length of the array specified, then later in the code we cannot change the length of that array, even if we use the redeem keyword. I've mentioned that in the first line of our code we create a static array, so its length or size doesn't change, cannot change. Remember that the compile error is a type of error that the Visual Basic Editor finds even before it starts running the code. So the code has not even actually run, but it doesn't matter. What matters is that let's make now a dynamic array. I can just click on the reset button to reset the project, so I will not see this yellow highlight in here. Of course, this has been highlighted because there is an error in the code, and we know that the error is that we want to redefine or resize a static array. Let's simply delete this definition from here, so this 1 to 5 from the employees array, and let me change the 1 to 6 to 1 to 5. In the first line of code, I'm declaring an array, but a dynamic array this time. If I didn't have the parentheses here, then I would declare a simple string variable, but with the parentheses, the Visual Basic Editor knows that I want to use an array. And this array is called employees, but I didn't declare the size of the array, so I've just simply declared a dynamic array here. In case of a dynamic array, we can later in the code change the size of the array, so we can resize the array, we can re-index the array. In the second line, I already resized the array or redimension it, but of course it is necessary because I have to give it some indexes. Let's run the code and confirm that the code is running even if we use a dynamic array, and it is running, so all the 5 names have been printed out successfully. Now let's say that after I print out the 5 names, I want to add a 6th name to the array, so I will have to redimension my array from 1 to 5 to 1 to 6. And let me copy this line of code. So to the 6th index I will add the name Mark, and I will also print it out. Let's run the code. Indeed, it is running correctly. First, the first 5 names have been printed out. Then I redimensioned my array, so I added a 6th index to my array. I assigned my name to that 6th index, and then I printed it out. Let's clear the immediate window, and let's say that I want to print out the name at the first index again. So before I print out Mark, I want to print out the name Paul again. Let's run the code. And Paul is not here, so we see that Mark is printed out, but instead of Paul we see an empty line. Paul was printed out initially, so here when we print out Paul, there is no problem. But after we redimension our array, we cannot print out Paul anymore. The reason is that if you redimension your array, then you will lose the data in it. It still has the index number 1, but the value has been removed from this index. And this is kind of problematic. I don't want to assign values to my arrays every time I redimension them. So I don't want to reassign these values. I don't want to duplicate this code just because I redimensioned my array and I added 1 additional index. Luckily, there is a solution for this. I can use the preserve keyword after the redeem keyword. You see that this is a keyword because it has been capitalized by the Visual Basic Editor and it's also in blue. So if you redimension your dynamic array with the redeem preserve keywords, then you don't lose the data that is already in your array. So now a 6th index will be added to the employees array. I will assign the name Mark to it, but still Paul will be printed out here because now Paul has been preserved, so the values of the array have been preserved despite resizing or redimensioning or reindexing it. Let's confirm now that poll has been preserved, so I will press F5. And indeed, this looks good. First, the first 5 names have been printed out. Then I have redimensioned my array, but I've preserved the values inside it. So now poll has been printed out, and mark also has been printed out at the new index. So far, we have worked with so-called one-dimensional arrays. In a one-dimensional array, we have one series of indexes, and we assign values using a single index, and we are printing out values using a single index as well. Of course, we don't necessarily print out the values, so it's better if I say that in a one-dimensional array, we retrieve the values of the array using a single index. Before complicating our lives a bit, I want to show you how you can save your code. I think I've already done it, but it cannot hurt if I show you again how you can do this. So the simplest thing you can do is to hover over this floppy icon and then save your workbook. But let's say I forgot to save my code and I close my Visual Basic Editor without saving it. Now my Visual Basic Editor has been closed, however I still have the workbook open into which I have written the code. And if I save the workbook now, then my code will be preserved. But let's say that I forget to do this as well, and I try to close my workbook. And now Excel asks me if I want to save the changes to my workbook. And you see that I didn't do anything in the workbook itself, so I didn't add any data to my sheet and I didn't delete any data from my sheet. It's a completely empty workbook. But still, because I have written VBA code into this workbook, Excel notices that something changed in the workbook, so it gives me this warning message. And at this point I can still save my VBA code, which I will do. So luckily I haven't lost my work. Everything is good, so it's time to move on